welcome to another video of me building the old world. Games Workshop have a long history of making some amazing terrain articles in the pages of White Dwarf. For many years there were useful articles on how to build houses, how to build hills, how to build trees, all kinds of useful tips and tidbits on how to make your own custom scenery for your tables at home. But in 1996 they published probably the seminal work on how to make Wargames Terrain, appropriately titled How to Make Wargames Terrain. This is sometimes known as the Big Red Book of Terrain. It was eventually replaced in the early 2000s by Mark II, How to Make Wargames Terrain, but I'm going to be following some of the advice today in the Big Red Book of Terrain and building a river section. So I want to make a 4-foot long river section to go down the width of the board for a future game I've got planned. I've been to my local hardware store and I've picked up a sheet of 3mm hardboard, which I have then broken down into 3 16-inch by 8-inch sections and 2 8-inch by 8-inch squares. I have then, utilising my trusty ruler and a pencil, marked out roughly where the banks are going to be on these sections, and I've then drawn kind of a roughly wavy edge along the sides. My intention is I'm going to take out my trusty sanding knife and sit here happily whittling away the edges before getting out some sandpaper and sanding down the edges to create a slight bevel. From there I'll be showing you the next step once that's complete. But before I do any of that I need appropriate safety equipment. I've got myself a dust mask because I don't want to breathe any of this in, and some safety goggles because I don't want any of this going in my eyes. So without further ado I'm going to get down to some cutting and shaping, and I will catch you back in a few moments when that is complete. Right, I'm back, slightly dusty, but thanks to my protective equipment, not filled my lungs with the dust. And yeah, I've got my sections all nicely cut out and sanded. The edges are all nice and slightly beveled and smooth. My plan here then is I'm actually going to have this smooth side that I drew the outlines on as the base of this. It's going to be that side down. The top side then, that's currently all rough, is what I'm going to coat in successive layers of card and other texturing devices as described in the How to Build Wargames Terrain book. So yeah, as per the advice in the How to Build Wargames Terrain book, I have got myself a selection of bits of cardboard of varying thicknesses. And the advice in the section on rivers in the Big Red Book of Terrain is to start with a cardboard base. As I say, I've gone with a 3mm hardboard base, something a bit more rigidity, a bit more longevity, hopefully, on this. But the next thing it simply suggests is to build up the banks of the river using successive layers of cards, and that's my plan. So I'm going to put some layers of thin card down first over the top of this rough surface, just to give me a smooth base to work over. Then my plan is just to draw around the various river sections on these thick pieces of card to get identical shapes to my rivers that I can cut out of the card, overlay over the top, and then just cut really to match the course of my river. I've got a nice big thick bottle of wood glue, again from the hardware store, just to hold it all together. So I'm going to set myself to now the task of cutting stuff out and gluing it all together, and then I will check back with you once I've done that. So I mean, first things first, I'm going to quickly draw around one of them while you're watching so you can see how well or otherwise I manage in this regard. So I've got myself a nice thick piece of card, got one of my board sections, and I'm just, stick it in the middle, break my pencil lead, then again, draw around it with the pencil. There we go, just like I'm going to cut it out. Alright, check back with me later, we'll see how many fingers I still have, and we'll see how I get on. Bye for now. Just thought I'd share while I'm at it. I found a slightly better way of cutting out the thick card sections. I'm just laying them on top of the thick card at this point, and then using my hobby scalpel to very neatly cut around them through the thick card. Seems to be working quite well. Moment of truth, pop it out. Might need to cut a little bit deeper there, I can do that. Because at least now I've got a cut to cut in. There you go. Very nice. through there, cut through there. A lot of these awesome hobby articles were written by the famous Nigel Stillman. If anyone's got any contact details for him, it would be lovely to talk to him at some point about some of this stuff. There we go. So that is almost... No, around. Here we are. That is an almost perfect match in the card. All I need to do now is cut the 6-inch-ish channel down the middle. And I found, again, the easiest way of doing that is just measuring a 6-inch section in the middle-ish. And then just cutting down the length of it. It seems to work quite well. Steel ruler being invaluable here. I can just use it as a straight edge and cut right along it like this. One. Flip it around. Other side. And two. You don't have to use cardboard for this, of course. You can just use like foam core, for example, if you want something with a bit more stability in the middle. I mean, I've got loads of cardboard lying around, so this was ideal for me, really. But there we go. One riverbank. Other side. Zip. And zip. Two riverbanks. Cool. Okay. Catch up with me once I've got these glued down. Okay, so I'm just at the gluing the cardboard banks on stage, and as you can see, I've set the thicker piece of cardboard slightly back from the edge on both sides, and it's just squeezing it down as I go, and it's kind of pushing out bits of that PVA glue as it goes. It doesn't matter if you get a bead of PVA glue down the edges like that, because we're going to cover that up in the next stage. But so that's that one done. I'm 1.5 left to do, and then we'll move on to the next stage once all of that is dry. In the meantime, just a little bit of an explanation as to why I've made the river pieces that I've made. I've made 3, as I say, 16-inch by 8-inch sections. The reason for that is I wanted the river to be at least 6 inches wide in the middle. If I've gone 8 inches wide, it just gives me an inch to play with on either side roughly for the banks, but I don't want the banks to be too high either, because I don't want this to kind of mound up over the tabletop till it looks almost like, you know, I've got a dike running down either side of the river as reclaimed land. The reason I've done the 2 smaller sections and the 3 bigger sections is, as like I said, I want it to be 4 foot long, but I want to have some wriggle room in there so I can manoeuvre things like this fatter section that's going to eventually have a jetty on it to different positions. And by having these 2 smaller sections, I can either position it so that it's in the middle of them, or I can use those to push it further along, or I can replace these smaller sections later on with a curved section, for example, to make just if I wanted to have a curving river across the corner of the board. The advice that the How to Make Wargames Terrain book has is plan your river out first, and that's exactly what I did here. I sketched it out on some bits of paper before I started cutting up any bits of wood, even so I knew exactly what pieces of wood I wanted. I haven't planned in any corner pieces or curves at this stage, because those are going to come later. They're not needed for the 4 foot long river section that I'm working on at the moment. Okay, well, I better get back to sticking bits of cardboard onto this. I will catch you shortly. Okay, it's the next day. All the cardboard has dried. Fantastic. So next stage, as recommended in the Big Red Book of Terrain, would be to mix essentially a texture paint up, so a mixture of sand and PVA, until I got kind of a thick, clumpy paste that I could then use to smooth off the edges of the embankments. I'm going to cheat slightly, because technology has moved on somewhat since the 1990s. I have got here an incredibly light tub of Polysil Advanced Polyfiller Ultra Light. I mean, this is literally, this is so light I can bat it around like it's a tennis ball. But this is non-toxic. I mean, don't go eating it by any attempts, but it's not going to burn your skin if you run your finger over it. And you can literally just scoop it up like ice cream, or, you know, like icing sugar out of a pan, and just smooth it on with your finger. I'm going to cheat. I'm going to just use this to build up the banks on my river sections. As you can see, it just goes on relatively easy. What I'll probably do is build up a layer along the edge there first. Dries to the touch in about 15 minutes. And yeah, I mean, it's water soluble, so you can wash it off anything you get it on you don't want it on. And yeah, my plan is to build up the banks with this, and then I will check back with you once that is all done and dry. Okay, catch you in a little bit. Yeah, when I said this stuff was non-toxic, I meant it was non-toxic, as in it probably won't hurt you if you eat it. However, having read the details on the back in slightly greater detail, let me say this first of all. Do not eat it. Beyond that, it is mostly harmless, but for legal reasons, let me stress now, you should probably wear latex gloves whilst you're applying this stuff. I used my bare hands and ended up with nothing more than a very slight tingling in my fingers after doing all 3 tile sections, but I would strongly urge you in the future, use some form of implement to apply it, like, for example, cheap disposable cutlery you can get for free at most major eateries, or wear gloves. Okay, so all that being said, oh, and the main side benefit of using cheap disposable cutlery is, because it's made of wood, it's recyclable, it's biodegradable, and you can snip the ends off once you've finished using the applicatory bit and use them to make more scenery. Hey! Okay, so all the tiles have now had a layer, two layers in fact, of the filler laid over the top. It has had the slight effect that it's made it curl upwards slightly edges. I mean, there isn't much I can do about that. I think in hindsight, maybe I would have used something to weigh them down on the ends as it was curing, but hindsight is 2020. What I've done is I've laid 2 layers of the filler over the top of the cardboard that I put on the edges. I've allowed that to dry each time for about a day in between before applying the next layer. And then at the end, I've donned on my mask and eye protectors and just give it a good rub over with a fine grade of sandpaper just to take some of the edges off. I don't want to take too much of the detail off. I've left it so it's still a little bit knobbly and bobbly because I still want it to have a little bit of detail to it before I apply static grass over the top. But I am now ready to move on to the next stage, and that is painting the river. Oh, you may have also noted, I've just added, before I applied the filler, I've added the 4 wooden pylons for what will be my little pier sticking out into the river for eventually to be my ferry port, a little ferry jetty. I'm not going to apply, I've got all the bits of, again, little coffee stirrers from a coffee shop. I've got all those ready to build the little pier once everything else is done. But I'm going to finish doing the whole of the river first, because otherwise I won't be able to get underneath the jetty to apply the water and paint and so forth that I need to do. But I've done the dowels first. These were literally just a daub of Gorilla Glue PVA, then it's a 3mm dowel from my local hardware store, cut each of the same length, which is essentially slightly taller than my ring bearer. And yeah, then just PVA'd onto the cardboard, and I've just then gone around it with a couple of layers of the filler again just to anchor it in place. And when I apply the water over the top, that will then give it an additional layer of support, I am hoping. Fingers crossed. So, like I said, yeah, next stage is going to be painting the river. I want to get that done, and then we're also going to paint the banks. The plan with the banks is I'm just going to paint them kind of a very light yellowy green, and then I'm going to apply static grass over the top. I'm going to do that before I apply any water effect. Likewise, the river needs to be painted. I'm going to paint the river, and then once the river is painted, I'm going to paint just a little bit of PVA along the edges of the banks here, and just apply some basic hobby sand. That'll just be to give kind of the shoreline edge of the bank. That will be the implication that that's before you get out into the deeper water. I'm going to paint the river first, then the banks, apply the PVA, apply the sand, and then once the sand is dry, I can just give it a very light layer of shading with perhaps a watered down contrast paint. So that's the plan for now. I'm going to do all of that, and I will catch up with you once that is done. I'm just going to quickly go through with you what paints I've picked out for my river. The big red book of terrain suggests a nice blue, and you know, everyone knows what colour is water. Water's blue, except generally speaking, if you look at a river, it's not blue. I mean, I'd love it if a river's with this lovely, glorious, shining blue, except I worry about the chemical content in it. My local river is the Thames, and it is, by the point it reaches us, it's kind of a greeny brown. So that's what I've gone for. I've gone for a mixture of Caliban green, War Flesh, and Nocturne green. I'm going to apply those, then while they're still a bit damp, I'm going to water down a little bit of Rhinox hide and just paint some ribbons of that over it. Then my plan is to just do 3 different little patches of contrast paint over it. Again, just to give it that little bit of differentiation so it doesn't all look one colour. So I'm going for some Dark Angels green, some Orc Flesh, and a little bit of Leviathan blue, in tribute, if nothing else, to the big red book of terrain. Once all that's done, if I'm happy with how it looks, I'll just leave it be. Otherwise, it's going to have just a thin down wash of Agrax Earthshade if it looks a little bit too greeny and I'd like it to look a bit more kind of murky, muddy brown. That's the plan. I'm going to crack on with it. Catch you in a bit. Right, okay, so that's all of the river sections painted. As you can see, I've done the banks, the river, and I've just also layered on the sand, and that's been given a paint over with Agaros Dunes, and then I've just a dry brush with Zandri Dust. The next stage, though, is obviously the penultimate stage, will either prove me to be a genius, with wisdom beyond my years, or a complete numpty. The advice in the Big Red Book of Terrain at this point is to either paint a thin layer of PVA glue all over this. I've tried that, it looks quite good. You get, occasionally you have to do it really thin, otherwise you get kind of white bits where you don't want them, but it does work. I'll just quickly throw up a picture here of one I've done earlier in that style, a little kind of Riddles in the Dark style diorama that I did many, many years ago. The alternative, it says, is you can paint a layer of varnish over this, or the more modern book that was released in the 2000s suggests you can use one of the commercially available water effects. Now, I've looked at how much the water effect stuff costs, and it is quite expensive for what I'm looking to do. I know there are probably cheaper ones out there, but for what I can get at my local hobby shop, it is a little bit more pricey than I'm willing to spend. But I think I may have hit upon an alternative, and you're probably wondering why I'm wearing a latex glove for this, and you'll see why in a minute. I have discovered No More Nails Transparent. This was about 12 quid down my local hardware shop, but it's a great honking big bottle. It's nearly 300 gram bottle, and I reckon it is more than enough to do all three of these river sections. But I'm going to try it on one first. If it horribly messes it up, then I will just go and try and peel it off. But at least I won't have ruined all three. So yeah, the reason for the latex glove will become apparent in a moment. My plan is to just crank some of this out onto here, dip my finger in this water, and just use that to smooth it along. We'll see how it works. If this works amazingly, then I am clearly a visionary. Otherwise, well, this will still make it into the final edit because cat-handedly making hobby stuff is kind of my jam. Here we go. Ooh, it's pumping out the nozzle. Oh, that is quite spaghetti-like. Ooh, come on. Right, so that's the first initial dollop. See, it's still squeezing out the end there. Still squeezing, you can see that. Yeah, so I'll just put kind of a spaghetti-like spool on here. I'm now going to wipe off the excess on there. Leave that still squidging out, but in the water goes my finger, and just smooth it over. Ooh, that's smoothing quite nicely, actually. Wouldn't want to do this with my bare finger because I'd end up glued to it, and I do have a habit of gluing myself to stuff, but that is smoothing out very nicely, and actually gives me the option to add a little bit of texture to it as well. That one spaghetti-like strand that I've squozen out, which is barely 10% of the bottle, has covered most of the middle section of this. Let's just give it a good squidge down. Cool, let's keep it all the way over to the banks as well. Okay, squeeze out some more. That's going quite well. Put a little ribbon in it there. Squeeze some out down this end. Squeegeing being a technical term. There we go. So that is about 1/6 of the bottle, and I think hopefully that will be enough to do the whole thing. Rub it all on, rub it all on. Rub it all the way up onto the banks as well. So hopefully this will dry like just a clear resin. And yes, I know I could have used epoxy resin for this, but I looked and it was more expensive than this. So I'm hoping that my cheap hardware store hack will do the trick. Slightly worried about this section over on the further bank here that's gone kind of overly white. Don't know why that one's gone like that. And despite my best efforts, it's not going any less white. I'll just swipe that bit I've taken off onto a bit of tissue. Clearly this is just some rough raw water. If I just do that. I hope it dries clear. If not, then that is some rough water. Okay, so there we go. All suitably reflective and watery looking. Let's stick the cap back on this for now. Peel off this latex glove. And we will see in the morning how the finished section looks. All being well, it turns out beautiful. Catch you in the morning. Okay, so it's morning. Bit of a mixed bag of success, to be honest. I'll show you the finished look. So there we go. Where it's dried, in some places it's almost like I've missed a bit, so you can't really see anything reflective at all. In other areas, the bit I was worried about it drying white hasn't really, and the bit that I thought would dry clear has actually dried with kind of some rough texture of white on the top. I'm not unhappy about it, because it does look a bit like rough water in a way. There's a few sections where it's dried in kind of almost like little splots, and I'm going to maybe go back over that and add either some more of this, or what I might do is just add like a grass tuft or something to look like essentially weeds or reeds sticking out through the top. But yeah, not the worst finish. I'm not the genius that I hoped I would be, but I'm going to do the rest of the tile sections like this, and then we'll see how the whole thing looks together. And then once the No More Nails cheap-ass water effect is dry, then the only thing really that's left to do is to cover the banks in static grass. So join me a bit later when I have covered the banks in static grass, covered the rest of the river sections in No More Nails, and we'll see how the almost finished river section looks. Catch you in a bit. Okay, so, well, yeah, that's the static grass done. I had hoped that giving my miracle idea of using the clear, transparent No More Nails more time to dry would mean that there'd be no risk of the static grass sticking to the surface of it. Unfortunately, as you can probably see, there is still a little bit of what I'm taking to be pondweed adhering to the surface there. I'm still fairly happy with it, to be honest. I mean, there's bits of the static grass that's kind of brushing off on my thumb as I go. I've added a few little tufts just as an experiment there on the edge of the bank. I was pretty happy with how those came out. So I've added a whole clump of them around what will eventually be the ferry jetty on this one, because the artwork, the footage from the film showed kind of clutches of rushes and stuff all growing up around the edge of the ferry as the hobbits are running to get onto Buckleberry Ferry. I might get a few bits of something else that's recommended in the Big Red Book of Terrain. I might get a few bits of like a brush maybe, like just a sweeping brush, snip those off and just stick those up as some slightly higher kind of bulrushes. But generally speaking, I'm pretty happy with how it's come out. I'm going to leave the glue on this to dry for just a little bit longer, and then I'm going to apply static grass to the other two banks, and then all together I will have my river section ready for when I get round to playing my first of my Fantasy Fellowship games. I hope you've enjoyed this mad delve into the world of scenery creation based upon what was in the original How to Make Wargames Terrain. If you've enjoyed this video, please click subscribe so you don't miss out on the chance to see when we get to use this in a game. In the meantime, if you are on Twitter or other kinds of social media, I share pictures of finished projects on there. So if you want to see the finished river, once I've got the static grass done on the remaining banks and built the little kind of platform for the ferry jetty, then perhaps give me a follow on Twitter or Threads or Instagram where you can see those there. Thanks very much for joining me on this one. I hope you've enjoyed it, and as ever, I shall catch you next time. Bye for now.